Yes, you've been sending your questions relating to Brexit, and here to answer them for you at Westminster is Jess Sargeant, who's from the Institute for Government. Jess, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Let's run you through the first question then. Des from Luton is asking, if a date other than the 31st of January 2020 is offered by the EU as an extension, can the Prime Minister decline such a date?
So under the terms of the Benn Act, which is the legislation that required the Prime Minister to seek an extension, if the EU agrees to the January deadline, then he is required to accept that deadline. If the EU requests a different date, then he can put that to Parliament, and if Parliament declines to approve that, then he can reject the extension. However, it's highly unlikely that MPs will say no to a different date, considering they were the ones that asked the Prime Minister to request an extension in the first place.
All right. Second question comes from Cyril in Crick, who's saying, can you please explain why the amendment from Sir Oliver Letwin, the Letwin Amendment, has not kicked in to prevent the UK leaving without a deal following it being approved by a parliamentary majority?
So the Letwin Amendment didn't actually require the government to seek an extension. It was the Benn Bill that did that. What the Letwin Amendment meant is that the deal wasn't approved on Saturday, and so the terms of the Benn Act kicked in and the Prime Minister was asked to request an extension. Now, he's now done that, and we're now waiting for the EU to say whether they accept that or not.
OK, Ben on Twitter, not me, I hasten to add, another Ben, is asking, the withdrawal agreement only heralds a 2-year trade negotiation, at which point either a deal is announced, an extension is requested, or we trade on no deal, question mark.
So there's kind of two forms of no deal that people are talking about at the moment. One is us leaving without a withdrawal agreement, and the second one is us leaving without a future trade agreement. Now, in both those cases, in order to prevent that happening after the deadline is up, an extension will be needed. And so that will require agreement from the EU. So there's really no way that we can unilaterally prevent that from happening. But there are ways to compel the Prime Minister to seek an extension in either case. OK, Scott from Windsor is asking, is there anything to stop Jeremy Corbyn resisting a general election until May 2022? I mean, obviously, there's nothing that can be done to force Labour MPs to back an early election motion. But there are ways that the government can seek an early election without the support of Labour MPs. So the vote that Parliament will have on Monday requires a 2/3 majority, and that will require the support of Labour MPs. But if that doesn't go through, instead the government could call a vote of no confidence in itself, which wouldn't require the support of Labour MPs. You'd only need a simple majority for that, and that could trigger an election. Or there's also potential for the government to pass a kind of one-line bill which overrides the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Again, that would only require a simple majority.
Rob on email is asking, I'd like to know what happens if, after a December election, if there is a December election, if there's no dramatic change in the parties and the Prime Minister has a smaller number of MPs, are we back at square one?
I mean, a lot of that will depend on whether or not the deal is passed before that election. If the deal's passed, then we start talking about the future relationship, and the Prime Minister will need to kind of proceed on a basis that has the support of a majority of MPs. If the deal isn't passed, and we end up with quite a similar situation to where we are now, then MPs will need to find a way through that impasse. I mean, one thing to remember is that even if the numbers for the political parties are the same, the actual individual MPs may be different. So where there is no majority for things now, so for example for no deal or for a second referendum, we might find ourselves in a different situation in which there is a majority for them in a new parliament.
OK, and also we've got Joe Clark on email saying, what happens if the DUP, the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland, withdraw their support for the government? Of course, they've got 10 MPs, they've been propping up the government.
Yeah, absolutely. So the confidence and supply agreement with the DUP covers a couple of things. It covers confidence and supply, which is about money and confidence in the government, and also on Brexit. Now, it's quite clear that the DUP doesn't support the government on Brexit at the moment, but it did still vote for the Queen's speech yesterday, which is usually a confidence matter. And so if the DUP then withdrew its support for the supply and confidence, it could prevent the government spending money by blocking things the government needs to do to authorise spending, or it could also back a no confidence vote in the government, which is when we might see an election or an alternative government formed.
Yeah. All right, well, those are the questions we've had. Let me just ask you a general question. Once again, we're in a state of a lot of confusion at the moment, aren't we? I mean, is there going to be an election? What kind of extension is the European Union going to give the UK beyond October the 31st?
I mean, we really don't know what's going to happen. A lot will depend on the early election motion that will be held on Monday, and how the Labour Party will vote in that motion. I mean, it's likely that if that isn't rejected, as I mentioned earlier, there are other ways that the government could try and trigger an election, and we're likely to see them try to do that. But I mean, still, a lot is unknown now.
And even if Jeremy Corbyn says he's happy to have an election, the question is whether Labour MPs actually go along with that, because we know a lot of them are pretty worried about the idea of an election, may not vote for it even if Jeremy Corbyn tells them to.
Yeah, absolutely. You need a two-thirds majority in this case, which is quite unusual in British politics. And there's also questions about whether the SNP will support it, and a lot of questions about other parties as well. So yeah, even if Labour do back it, we can't guarantee that that's what will happen.
Good to see you, Jess. Thank you very much indeed. Jess Sargeant from the Institute for Government.